Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, November 1st. While the world is watching the American elections and sitting on pins and needles about its outcome next week, we are going to be watching the world instead this morning. We'll start with an election, but not the United States election, but the one in Japan. Just weeks after taking office, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba called a snap election and immediately lost his majority in the Japanese Diet. With no governable majority in sight, where is Japan going, and what will this mean for the United States and for the region? Then, the surprise deployment of 10,000 North Korean troops to Russia, the first time Moscow has welcomed foreign forces onto its territory in more than a century. What can we say about this budding alliance between Pyongyang and Moscow? And is the rest of the world, not least Seoul, Beijing, and Washington, reacting to this? And finally, we return to Gaza, where the humanitarian situation is getting ever more desperate. Last month saw the fewest 8 carrying trucks being allowed into the strip since the beginning of the year. Israel continues to strike targets, including hospitals, especially in the north of the strip, which some Israeli commentators would like to see emptied of all civilians. The United States has issued some strong warnings, but will it act after the election? Yasmeen Abutaleb is here to talk with us, as is Ken Moriyasu and Anton La Guardia. Yasmeen is with the Washington Post, Ken is with Nikkei Asia, and Anton La Guardia with The Economist. Good morning, all three to you. You're, I think, all in Washington for once. So that's now the center of the universe for people looking at what's happening next week. But we're not going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about this week. Ken, let's start with you. Really, first of all, a surprise election called to strengthen the majority. It misfired big time for Prime Minister Ishiba, who lost his majority, and it looks like he's in trouble, and no one else can get a majority. So, what happened with this election, and what are the implications?
Right. So the Japanese lower house had one more year until its term was ended, but following the LDP leadership race, in which he won, the new Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba wanted to call a snap election to strengthen his foothold so that he would have a mandate to conduct the policies that he's been talking about. Instead, it backfired, and he lost not only the LDP single-party majority, but including the coalition with the Komeito. This is the first time in 15 years that the LDP and the Komeito don't have a coalition, which means that next week, when they convene the parliament and they choose a new prime minister, Ishiba might lose and become Japan's shortest-serving prime minister in history if he does not gather 18 more votes to reach the majority. And to do this, he is looking to reach out to a party, a centrist party called the DPP, Democratic Party of the People. And it is a moderate party, but it does have very strong views on economy and some views on foreign policy that might be at odds with the LDP. In a nutshell, the economic policies, there's more money in the hands of the regular people. So it's calling for halving the consumption tax from 10% to 5%. It's also calling for an expansion of the no tax for part-time workers until a certain income bracket. These will be very much opposed by the Ministry of Finance, who wants to keep a tight lid on spending. But also, most importantly for America, it has some unique security policies, including one that Japan is too dependent on the US. And for its defense production, it talks about strengthening its own defense industrial industry to make its own weapons for the SDF. Let's not buy too many weapons from America, which might be a trouble if there is a Trump administration. But the whole premise of the Pentagon's Indo-Pacific strategy in recent days is to team up with allies and partners to compensate for the lack of defense industrial capability, because China, on the other hand, has a massive defense industry. But if this DPP has a veto on every decision to team up with America. This could be problematic with America. For instance, America and Japan are now talking about producing Patriot missiles in Japan and air-to-air missiles in Japan to backfill the warehouses, American warehouses that have been depleted because they're supporting Ukraine and Israel. This centrist party could put conditions like, we can co-produce, but we must make sure that these missiles never go to Ukraine, certainly not go to Israel. And that would hamper cooperation. And each time, the US-Japan alliance will have to contend with this veto. So that's the overall picture.
I guess the big question is this the only government that is likely to, so that the veto power of the DP of this party is going to be a essential part of the outlook, or are there alternatives?
Well, so this the head of the DPP is called Mr. Tamaki. He is the Joe Manchin of Japan. He is the kingmaker. He has the pleasure of choosing whichever side he wants to go. If he chose to go with the opposition this time, the Constitutional Democrats, Noda, the former prime minister, the leader of the opposition, could become the prime minister. But it doesn't look like that. It looks like he's going to vote in his own name, which would lead up to Ishiba keeping his seat, because Ishiba would have the most number of votes. But even if Ishiba were to continue, at any time, Tamaki, the Joe Manchin, could vote in favor with the opposition for a no confidence vote, and that would bring down Ishiba's government at any time. So it's a very weak government, which is not ideal. Japan, if there is a Trump administration, Japan would like to have a strong government. Trump likes strong leaders, and he doesn't like dealing with weak leaders. This is potentially very problematic for the alliance.
Yasmeen, of course, everybody in Washington, including White House reporters, are looking to elections in the United States, but clearly the Biden administration has put a lot of stock into the relationship with Japan, building this lattice network of alliances. The South Koreans were in town, and we'll talk about that in a minute this week. What are you hearing from your sources in the White House and elsewhere about what this means for their strategy towards the Indo-Pacific, which is really based on this core of Japan, to some extent Australia and Korea, as the foundation of it?
I think that's exactly it, Ivo. I think there's a lot of concern about any sort of destabilization in the Japanese government, because a lot of the Biden administration's strategy to counter China, which they obviously have a number of foreign policy issues right now that, are far from resolved or not going to be resolved. But one of the, I think what they saw as one of the shining beacons of their foreign policy was what they had accomplished on China, on building these alliances throughout Asia and the Indo-Pacific. And Japan was the keystone of that. They worked very hard to build this sort of trilateral relationship between the US, Japan, and South Korea. They took a lot of pride in that, overcoming these big historical challenges to sort of build that alliance. And Japan is sort of the strongest, most stable country in the region in terms of, the partner that they need to take on China, or to have a reliable partner against China. I also think what's happening in Japan is sort of reflective of what we see happening here in the UK and a number of countries where the politics are so divisive. We don't have elections very often anymore anywhere where there's in democracies, at least, where there is a very clear winner, or someone who comes out with a, highly governable majority. So in some ways, it's almost a prelude to what we could see in our own elections, not just with the presidency, but with the House and the Senate. Obviously, we don't call snap elections, but just this sort of divided government, or someone not coming out with a majority. But I think, for the Biden administration, they have always said China was the top geopolitical threat, even above Russia, even after Russia launched its war against Ukraine. And so if they lose their most stable partner in the region, or can't rely on them as heavily, I think that really puts into question, or puts at risk, the alliances that they've spent so much time building. They've obviously worked to build alliances with other countries like India, Vietnam, other countries throughout the Indo-Pacific, but these countries are not nearly as strong or as reliable as Japan in terms of building this alliance and building a bulwark against China.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Anton, take the big picture a little bigger. I think there's one person perhaps who's very happy about this, and he's sitting in Beijing, because anything that sort of weakens the Western counter pressure or creates tensions among allies plays to Beijing's favor. How do you think they see it, and more generally, how do you interpret what's likely to come next, given a weaker, less decisive Japan?
Well, you will have heard President Xi Jinping this year talk about the fact that the Americans are trying to encircle China and contain it, and that America was building an Asian NATO. Now, that's all horribly overblown, but there is a germ of truth to it, which is that this lattice work of alliances that you mentioned, which America has been building, has sort of gone all along the Chinese seaboard, that first island chain. And you may be able to see a map over my shoulder, and you'll see a chain of islands that runs from China all the way down to Australia, in effect. And those are all American friends and allies, some of them treaty allies, some of them friends and partners. But America has been busily stitching together a more solid alliance. The system in Asia, unlike in Europe, is of hub and spokes, where everyone has a separate alliance with America, and it has been trying to create something that is more coherent and cohesive. And it's hard to overestimate how important Japan is to that effort. First of all, because it's a huge economy. Second of all, because it has, in the past year or two, announced a very large increase in defense spending. And one of the questions in Washington's mind will be, is that a sustainable policy in Japan now, given the political weakness? And the third thing the Japanese have done is become much more actively involved with all the other partners. So they've been providing Coast Guard cutters to the Philippine Navy. They've had a status of forces agreement with Australia, both for them to deploy in Australia and for Australian troops to deploy in Japan. And so this is all part of the sort of thickening of the security relationships in Asia, and the uncertain election places a question mark over all of that. Now, I'm assuming that the driving force of all this has been the sense that people in Asia close to China feel about the rising military threat from China. So you have to assume that will continue. But for Xi Jinping, this certainly offers an opening, an opportunity to try to undo some of that work that America has been doing rather quietly but effectively in Asia.
I guess that is, Ken, the real question is, and for scholars of international politics as opposed to journalists, although you do the first drafts of history. There's always this question: what drives a nation's interest? Is it the sort of the high systemic level, which would be the competition with China, or is it the domestic political level? Of course, it's a combination of both. So I think Anton puts the question squarely in front of Tokyo, which is, the strategic situation that led you to change all your policies with regard to defense spending and et cetera, that I think Anton laid out very nicely, hasn't changed. In fact, it's going to get worse, particularly if Donald Trump is president, may get a lot worse. So that's one driving force for continuity. But on the other hand, I think rightly, as you say, Ken, the domestic politics is leading on a different direction. So how do you think this plays out?
Yeah, what Anton said about the defense spending is very crucial. If you think of the nature of the policies that the DPP, the centrist party, is advocating for, it's more money in the people's hands, bringing down consumption tax. So there is absolutely no way they would say yes to increase taxes to fund the significant increase in defense spending. So the Ishiba is going to have to find money from somewhere else, but there isn't any money. Social spending, cutting social spending is very hard because so many of the people are retirees in Japan. So that's going to be a huge challenge. And also, if you look at the importance of Japan to the alliance, the number one importance is the presence of 54,000 American troops. There are so many military bases in Japan that will be the launching point for any operation in the Taiwan Strait. So if the DPP has been talking about a more equal relationship with the Americans regarding these bases. Like, as of now, American servicemen are protected. They have immunity in whatever they have, be it car accidents, if they're drunk driving. They're pretty much, the Japanese legal system cannot reach the American servicemen. But the DPP, as part of its populist policies, is calling for, American servicemen have to be subject to Japanese laws, just like every other Japanese person. These are small things, but they do hamper the U.S. Operations, I think.
Yeah, no, I think those are actually they're small things, but they're huge in American politics. Status of forces agreements are incredibly important, and the idea that foreign governments can criminally prosecute service people who are there to defend the country is very, very tough. So,
especially under Trump.
Yeah, no, exactly under Trump, but I think it would generally be true under almost anyone, in part because of the politics of it here at home. It leaves me the conversation leaves me with really sort of two observations. One, to Yasmeen's point about elections creating turmoil. We have once again seen an election in which an incumbent was thrown out of office or severely weakened, like Modi. It was true with the Conservatives in the UK. It was true with India. It was true not with Mexico, probably the one difference, but it was true with the South Africa and the ANC. Now in Japan and who knows in the United States. That from that perspective, it does not bode well for the incumbent here in the U.S. And then, secondly, is this fundamental question of if the relationship between Japan and the United States changes, particularly on the military side, the impact that would have if politics in the U.S. changes is going to be big. So we'll have to watch it. But Ken, thanks for sort of helping us get into this really important issue. Anton, let's switch over to. What really you couldn't have written a novel about this 3 weeks ago. The idea that Russia in the middle of a war is hosting 10,000 Ukrainian troops in order to fight North Korean troops in order to fight the Ukrainians inside Russia. This is pretty remarkable. How do you first tell us what is happening? As we look at it, and then secondly, what do you make of it?
Well, it is an extraordinary development, but the geopolitics of the world are changing very fast. And one of the most striking developments has been how the war in Ukraine has consolidated and brought together the so-called axis of autocracy, in which Russia has obtained military components and machinery from China, has obtained drones and possibly missiles from Iran, and has obtained ammunition, missiles, and now soldiers from North Korea. And the North Koreans appear to be sending 10,000 troops, which is a modest number, but still significant because of the symbolism that you mentioned. And as you said, it's the first time in a century that foreign troops have been admitted to Russia. The Americans say they have been trained and equipped by Russia, and they've been training in trench clearance. And the implication being, therefore, that they're going to be put in the front line meat grinder of Russia's war. Interestingly, they seem to be going to Kursk and not to Ukraine itself. In other words, Kursk is a bit of territory of Russian territory that the Ukrainians have nibbled, even as Russian forces have been making inroads in eastern Ukraine of late. So North Korean troops will be defending Russian territory against an invading force. And I think that will be of significance to people who are sitting on the fence in all this. In the West, it's seen as an escalation, certainly in Europe. And the question is whether it destabilizes things in Asia and what can be done about it. We've just seen this week North Korea testing an ICBM. It's the longest flight yet, with the implication that North Korea can now reach every part of the continental United States. You've also seen North Korea move away from the ideology of unification. It's blown up roads that were connecting the Kaesong industrial area to South Korea. It has abandoned formally the belief in future unification, and the kind of cross-border tension is getting worse as the South Koreans resume propaganda broadcasts against North Korean troops on the border, and the North Koreans send balloons filled with filth and much else across the border. The question is, what happens next? We saw the South Korean foreign and defense ministers in Washington meeting their counterparts, but they announced no specific measures. It is possible, I suppose, that South Korea will supply weapons directly to Ukraine henceforth. That was a persistent question which the South Korean delegation did not want to answer. But what is also striking is that they're adopting a more regional role, where they say they will be involved in training troops from ASEAN countries and from Pacific Island nations. And that is a development that I think the Chinese will be worried about, seeing the South Koreans become more regionally involved in this lattice work that we spoke about earlier. And America's big hope really is that China will exert pressure on North Korea, although I think that hope is rather forlorn. But they cling to the belief that China is worried about things it's seeing, particularly this growing alliance between Russia and North Korea, and might want to try and put a stop to it. But don't hold your breath.
A lot there, Anton. I think you hit all of the really important points. And Yasmeen, you heard in Washington over the last few days from the State Department and the White House, Defense Department, deep concern about this relationship, and this word that it will change, they will become a participant in the war the moment they actually join the fight. It raises this really interesting question. Will the U.S. be okay if Ukraine uses U.S. weapons against North Koreans inside Russia, which is where the fight would be? Because the question will be, will the North Koreans see that as U.S. participation in the war in the way the Russians have tried to play that? My sense is this is not a question that is easily answered in Washington, and yet the reality is U.S. weapons are in Russia with the Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region, and if they get attacked, they will be used. So how do you see that, and what do you hear about it?
Well, I think like everything we're talking about, so much of this will depend on who is elected president. But we know in the Biden administration, the person who has been most resistant to allowing Ukraine to use U.S. weapons to strike inside Russia is Biden himself. I think there's actually quite a bit of support across the rest of the administration, including in the State Department, less so in the Defense Department, to allow Ukraine to take those steps, even before this, troubling alliance with North Korea emerged, where they're sending troops to Russia. There has been this sense from critics that the Biden administration provides Ukraine enough to continue the war, but not enough to win. And this, of course, would complicate the effort even further, because you have another country sending troops to help Russia, and you don't have that on the Ukrainian side. As much as there's been the Western alliance that's been led by the U.S., no country, the U.S. or European allies, has sent troops and shows any indication that they are going to send troops to help Ukraine. That's sort of been a red line for most of the countries. And so I think they will have to make these calculations over whether North Korea will see that as a direct provocation. Obviously, the biggest fear from Biden with Russia is that it would trigger a sort of Cold War era conflict if U.S. weapons were used in Russia, and Russia could say that that's a direct attack from the U.S. and that could trigger a direct confrontation. I think there's a sense across the administration that Russia doesn't want that escalation, that there's a lot of bluster, but that's not the way Biden sees it. And so I think you're right, Ivo, that there's no sort of simple calculation here as to how you make that decision, whether U.S. weapons can be used there. But I think there is a real fear that if you maintain the lines that the U.S. has had so far, that Ukraine cannot use these weapons inside Russia, even when there are North Korean troops there, that they're setting them up to fail, or at least not to make any advancements. And this will make the war for Ukraine much harder. It's already been sort of a grind without much progress for almost 2 years now. So it's unclear to me. I'm not a military expert how much the North Korean troops will make a difference. Like Anton said, it's not a huge number, but still, I think there is also a signal that's sent if the U.S. keeps sort of refusing to give Ukraine additional powers with U.S. weapons, because it makes very clear what the U.S. limit is, and Russia, North Korea, and other allies of Russia can keep sort of pushing on that line.
Yeah, and I think the same argument is happening in Europe in some ways. And Anton, you mentioned that it was taken very seriously. The question of actually sending troops to Ukraine has now reemerged with the Lithuanians in particular saying, well, maybe we should go back to those conversations that Mr. Macron had in the beginning of the year. And again, I think if how the U.S. election rolls out will have some influence on it. Ken, big deal for Japan, bigger deal even for South Korea. This budding alliance between Russia and North Korea in some ways, it's just, I think we talked a few months ago about this new security treaty between Russia and North Korea. That really is a Cold War agreement. The things I'm hearing in Washington is that this was as much the North Koreans wanting to deploy to demonstrate they're good allies as it was Russians wanting North Koreans. But the reality is that's what's happened. And that's complicating things, I would think, in Tokyo when it comes to and Seoul for how to deal with North Korea.
Well, actually, I think it's the biggest deal for China, because they are very uncomfortable with this development. I talked to Chinese diplomats, and they said that they think there are two reasons why Kim Jong-un is doing this. One is to gain combat experience for the North Korean troops. They haven't really fought in any battles. And two is because he wants to get paid. And according to the South Korean spy agencies, Russia is paying $2,000 a month for each of these soldiers. And the soldiers themselves don't get much of it. All of it goes to the state. But I've read that the salary of the North Korean soldiers has increased tenfold in the recent months. So that's one. But I think if you look at North Korea's motives for doing this, I think, as you say, it is to reinforce this new security alliance and to curry favor with Putin, so that in a scenario, in a crisis in North Korea, that Russia will come to its assistance. And this is very much relevant because, as Anton said, the North Koreans have declared that they will abandon unification. But on August 15th, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol announced his own unification doctrine, which was a unilateral plan for unification, saying that it's basically expanding South Korea, the Republic of Korea, through democracy and freedom, and to incorporating whatever elements in the North there is that agree with this. This is very troubling for North Korea. And I think Kim Jong-un is very actively responding to this threat with a proposal that he sees as a threat. And what's interesting is that in Japan, there is a new thinking that maybe the best way to deter China from taking action on Taiwan is to have tension on the Korean Peninsula. If there is the prospect of a war on the Korean Peninsula and the prospect of millions of people, refugees, flooding into the northern border to China, that would be a nightmare for China. And they will definitely have no capacity to take any action in Taiwan. So there is this new thinking in Japan. Until now, the priority in Japan's foreign policy was peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. The new thinking I hear is that maybe tension somewhere could lead to stability in other places. And I think that's in the minds of Kim Jong-un, in the mind of Yoon Suk-yeol, in the minds of Ishiba, and definitely in the mind of Xi Jinping.
That's fascinating, Anton. And I, you mentioned at the end of your opening this U.S. desire to see if they can get the Chinese to intervene, and Ken, I think, rightly mentions the Chinese are not happy about what's happening with this relationship between Russia and North Korea. Agasta was reporting today that senior U.S. officials met with the Chinese officials in Washington this week, including Kirk Campbell, the Deputy Secretary of State. There is a huge premium for geostrategic and other reasons to see if you can build a wedge into in between Russia and China. How seriously do you think people in Washington are taking that, and how likely do you think it's going to have any impact?
So I think they're taking the problem extremely seriously. Do they think they have a good chance of driving a wedge between China and the rest? I mean, I think they're giving it a try, but so far, Xi Jinping has stayed true to his promise of friendship without limits with Vladimir Putin. Now, I mean, obviously there are limits. I mean, they've, for example, said they don't want to see the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They have stopped short of providing actual weapons for the most part. They provided components and machine tool equipment and so on. But the assumption in Washington is that the Chinese are very uncomfortable. And the Americans are certainly taking every opportunity to highlight the things that make the Chinese feel uncomfortable. But it seems to me the Chinese have a very high tolerance for discomfort because they're trying to, weaken and prize apart the American alliance system that they see as constraining them. Ken said something very interesting, I thought, by the way, that that tensions in the Korean Peninsula could be good for the Taiwan Strait. I mean, what I have heard is the concern, the mirror image of that concern, which is the fear that a crisis in one place could be seen as an opportunity for another party to take advantage. So if there were trouble in the Taiwan Strait, that could be the trigger for war on the Korean Peninsula and vice versa. And in turn, those things reverberate across the Eurasian landmass and have an impact on Europe. I think what we're seeing is the growing interconnection of security in Europe and Asia, and many threads are becoming increasingly apparent. Not least the fact that the Chinese and the Russians do joint patrols in Asia and have been as far as Alaska.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. There, and it's clearly that's one implication. This closer sense, both in Europe and Asia, that their futures are getting more and more tight, not only economically, which they had long been, but also in a security perspective. I think that's true. And I think Anton sort of has a warning for the Japanese idea, for the idea in some Japanese circles, Ken, that you mentioned, that instability somewhere is a way to produce peace and security somewhere. Sometimes when there's instability, it spreads all over the place. And any student of the Middle East would tell you, if you just think you can contain it in one place, you're going to be in trouble. But in any case, fascinating set of issues that are happening with huge geopolitical and strategic implications and economic implications ultimately. Great, thanks, Ken, for that Anton for that overview, and everyone for chiming in. Yeah, Yasmeen, speaking of the Middle East, let's talk in our last segment here about Gaza. It's sort of under the radar screen because of the elections in the United States, but also because, of course, we had the Israeli retaliation last week for Iranian strikes and the continuing war inside Lebanon. But what's happening in Gaza is, and particularly in the north, is pretty significant, because it does suggest that U.S. views of what needs to happen in Israeli actions and Gazan realities are increasingly working at cross purposes.
Yeah, no, you're right. This has sort of flown under the radar because the Biden administration has not wanted to speak publicly very much about what's happening in Gaza in the final weeks of the campaign. That obviously hasn't stopped it from coming up on the campaign trail quite a bit. And I think a lot of why we're seeing, I've been following all of Harris's events in this final stretch, and she is getting interrupted pretty repeatedly by, pro-Palestinian protesters, people upset about Gaza. And I think it's because the situation is rapidly deteriorating from already a sort of catastrophic level. And like you said, especially in the north. So Israel launched these operations in the north a couple weeks ago where they are moving hundreds of thousands of people out. The UN has said they're is no safe passageway because the bombing has been relentless. There's no safe place for them to go because pretty much all of Gaza at this point has been reduced to rubble. There's really no habitable part of the enclave anymore. And this, of course, is, just repeated displacement, one after the other. And then the other big development that we saw this week was that the Israeli government passed a bill banning UNRWA operations from not only Gaza, but from East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And you had Secretary of State Antony Blinken warning that this would be horrific and catastrophic for an already deadly humanitarian situation in Gaza, because UNRWA is pretty much the only organization that's set up to deliver aid and provide services. And then not only that, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, they provide education services and other sort of basic necessities to Palestinians who live in those territories. So I think what you see is the U.S. and Israel headed for, it sounds redundant because we've seen it so many times this year, but had probably headed for a pretty big clash, or at least a big test of the relationship once the elections are over, because you had Blinken and the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, send a letter to Israel a couple weeks ago saying if there weren't dramatic changes in the humanitarian aid situation in Gaza, that the U.S. would have to reassess providing military aid to Israel. And they gave them 30 days. And this basically took it to right after the election so that there didn't have to be a decision before then. But that's going to, the Biden administration is going to have to, and the president himself is going to have to decide whether they want to take action, because I think you have every international humanitarian organization, most vocally the UN, warning that the situation in Gaza is unacceptable, it's untenable. I think the UN has said everyone in the north is going to die without dramatic changes. And there's still 300,000 or 400,000 people left in the north of Gaza right now. You had the Jordanian foreign minister with Blinken this week saying that what Israel was doing in the north amounted to ethnic cleansing. So you have leaders from all over the world warning that this situation is amounting to crimes against humanity. And the U.S. again is going to be tested on how seriously it wants to take those claims and whether it wants to do anything to change what has been largely unconditional military support to Israel for more than a year now. We haven't been maybe talking about it as much just because there's so much going on with domestic U.S. politics. But I think this is set to come up and to blow up again immediately after the elections are over.
I think that's exactly right. This is just a problem that's not going to go away. And Anton, you do have a sense that something is qualitatively changing up in the north, in particular, and we've had, leaks of this quote general's plan that some folks in Israel are pushing, which is to basically empty out North Gaza and say if you are still living there, then you must be a Hamas terrorist. So you're a combatant and a target. And although the government has not embraced the plan, you kind of wonder whether they're not implementing it, given the way that is happening. And that just feeds the anxiety that so many governments around the world, and including, I think, the U.S. government, have had. Do you see, not only in Washington, love your sense, which you're reporting from, but also in other parts of the world, particularly in Europe, a sense that things can't go on any longer?
Well, we felt for a long time that things couldn't go on for very long, and it's gone on for more than a year. And I think Israelis themselves are surprised by how long the war has continued to drag on, and that has to do with the fact that Bibi Netanyahu has a very right-wing coalition that doesn't want to stop the war, wants to keep fighting, and he has members within his government who would like to clear Gaza out and make it available for resettlement by Jewish settlers. So the suspicion of what the government is doing is always going to be there because of the nature of Bibi's coalition. It is also possible that you could read it in another way, which is that they have no plan, which is that their only plan is to keep fighting. And whenever they see Hamas pop up, they feel they have to strike them again. So it's a kind of war of diminishing returns. One of the things that's happened is that Netanyahu has challenged Joe Biden repeatedly, and in recent times has felt vindicated. in that he has been able to decapitate Hezbollah in Lebanon when the Americans said don't go to Lebanon, and he's decapitated several layers of Hezbollah's leadership, and he's very recently claimed the scalp of Yahya Sinwar, who was a leader of Hamas, the person they really wanted to get. So, and in Rafah, where the Americans had said, don't go to Rafah, and the Israelis are saying, look, we went and look what we found. So Netanyahu is feeling totally vindicated at the moment. He knows American politics is very polarized, and he's got at least half the country behind him, the whole of the Republican Party and part of the Democratic Party. So he doesn't feel under particular pressure to act this side of an election. And I think he's waiting to see what happens thereafter. Now, it also has to be said that Hamas itself has thought time was on its side, that global pressure was increasing on Israel, and it has wanted to keep fighting, and it's saying it's not going to release hostages until there's a sort of permanent cessation of violence. So, most of the Palestinian population is held trapped by these two combatants with nowhere to go, because unlike other countries where refugees tend to go to neighboring countries to seek safety, nobody will admit the Palestinian population of Gaza, whether it's Egypt or Israel itself. So it is a catastrophic tragedy with many people who will share the guilt and the horrors of what's happening.
I think that's for sure. Ken, I think it's fair to say that if anything like this were to happen anywhere in the world, and Israel was not a participant, and the U.S. wasn't providing weapons to one of those participants, the outcry would have been pretty large. And a country, particularly Japan, which cares deeply about the United Nations and the Charter and international law and humanitarian law, how has the Japanese government focused on this issue, and what do you think its evolving stance is likely to be?
Yeah, what's happening in Israel and Gaza has huge consequences for Japan, and I will get to that, but it's a long story. First, starting from the northern Gaza issue, I think the reason why the Israelis are doing this is to create a buffer zone, as you say, because I believe that the Israelis are protecting Tel Aviv. As long as Hamas is in the northern Gaza area, they can reach Tel Aviv. So I think the idea is to push back and create a buffer zone. Whether that's a war crime, I won't get into that. But if you ask the Israelis, they would say that they're not stopping humanitarian aid going into Gaza. They're just stopping the humanitarian aid going to the north of Gaza, and that they have repeatedly warned the Palestinians to move out of northern Gaza for this reason. But as Yasmeen said, there is nowhere to go. So whether that's a legitimate thing to demand, that's another question. But the big takeaway here is that I think Israel has taken security into its own hands and is not listening to America. This is because America continues to talk about the two-state solution, which is totally unacceptable for the Israelis right now. And as Anton said, they feel vindicated for the victories that they've had. And the big thing that Japan is watching is that Israel is probably not done with Iran. And the recent attacks taking out the missile production sites was just a down payment of what will happen, what will come, especially if there is a Trump administration. And the Israelis, I hear, are looking at the number of ballistic missiles that Iran has left. And the number I hear is 800. And in the past two occasions where Iran fired missiles at Israel, there were 200 missiles each. And 200 caused no damage. So if there is another attack, Iran will probably launch more than 200, maybe 300. That means there are 3 or 4 attacks that Iran can conduct against Israel before they have nothing left. And that allows Israel to calculate. But the problem is that Israel also is running out of air defense systems, Patriot systems. So they will, if it comes to that, I think they will come to America to ask for help. And even Harris has said that she will never hold aid for self-defense. So in that scenario, America will provide Patriot missiles for Israel, and this will consume American foreign policy for the next 3 years, and that would totally take the eye off the Indo-Pacific. So leading up to 2027, I think America, inevitably, whatever the next president says about the Indo-Pacific, Israel will be the number one priority, definitely. And then Japan will, Asia will be in competition with Ukraine for the number 2 slot, because America cannot do all 3 fronts. So it has implications in that sense.
Well, we'll have to see if that's in fact the case. But it is, I think it is a provocative view, and it certainly, I think, reflects an Asian view that somehow the United States cannot entangle itself from the Middle East, even if it says and wants to. And I think there's certainly a lot of truth to that. I really want to thank Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia, Yasmeen Abutaleb from the Washington Post, and Anton La Guardia of The Economist for really an incredibly insightful 45 minutes. And we barely touched the U.S. election, and I think our listeners and people tuning in will be happy to have at least 45 minutes of really dire stories, but not about what's happening in the United States. And you've made them all wiser in that. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a good weekend, and if you're an American citizen, please vote if you have not already done so. It is the one power that no one can take away from you. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.